The cold northern wind cut through the trees, biting the skin with every gust. It was a relentless chill, the kind that seemed to freeze the bones, a bitter reminder that the men in the snow were far from any semblance of safety. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, a frozen wilderness, untouched by time and war. The world here was not one of clear lines, nor one of clarity. It was a place where the earth itself fought back, as if to say that the battles waged above were no more than specks in the vast, merciless expanse of winter. The Finnish soldiers were crouched low along the edge of a ridge, their forms blending into the white surroundings, barely more than silhouettes against the backdrop of snow-covered pine trees. Every breath they took sent a puff of visible air into the freezing night, a reminder that survival here was as much about enduring the cold as it was about facing the enemy. Captain Immo Salonen stood a few paces away, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. His face was gaunt, marked by years of war, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, were the same as they had been when he first enlisted. He had seen too many men die, too many operations fail, and too many sacrifices made for causes that seemed distant and uncertain. Yet tonight, the stakes were different. Tonight, his orders were clear. Move against the Soviet forces or risk losing everything. The radio crackled to life, its static breaking through the wind's mournful howl. The message was brief, to the point, almost too final. Prepare for immediate action. The Soviets are advancing. You are to break their hold on the northern front, now. The order was not a request. It was an ultimatum. Salonen's grip tightened on his rifle. His men, hardened by months of relentless fighting, stood in silent formation behind him. The air around them was filled with the scent of snow and fear. But they said nothing. They knew the risk. They knew the odds. But they had no choice. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was the heart of the war. The land around them, blanketed in white, was anything but still. It was the silent tension of waiting, the kind that presses down like the weight of 1,000 invisible forces. To the men crouched in the snow, this was not just another night. This was the precipice one step closer to the front lines, one step closer to a mission that felt more insane than any they had ever undertaken. Salonen's mind raced, calculating distances, assessing the situation. They were small in number. They were cold, but they had one thing left, the element of surprise. And tonight, they would use it to their advantage. Tonight, we end it, Salonen muttered, more to himself than anyone else as he turned toward his men. They moved, slipping silently into the snow, skis cutting through the frozen terrain. The wind howled behind them, but they did not stop. This night, they would make history, or they would not return at all. The wind had picked up by the time Captain Immo Salonen and his men moved into position, but the harsh chill didn't seem to touch them. They were used to it, molded by months in the unforgiving Finnish wilderness. Snow had become their ally, their camouflage, their secret weapon. As the squad trudged through the snowdrifts, the only sound was the soft swish of skis gliding across the frozen landscape. They were like shadows against the white expanse, their movements swift and silent, each man fully aware of the risks ahead. Salonen's mind was constantly calculating, ticking through the terrain like a map etched in his brain. He wasn't just the leader of a unit. He was a man who had learned how to survive by breaking the rules. The military manuals, the procedures, the rigid strategies, none of them mattered here. The war they were in wasn't about following orders to the letter. It was about improvisation, about using the land and whatever they could scrounge together to survive. The same principles that had gotten him and his men through the toughest battles now guided him. He glanced back at his men. Ski troops, each trained to move like whispers in the snow, to strike without a trace. Their equipment was light, only what they could carry on their backs. But what they lacked in gear, they made up for in resourcefulness. Every man in this unit had been molded by war. And in war, ingenuity was just as valuable as a rifle. Salonen had never asked for much, but what he did ask for, he demanded with fierce intensity. Adaptability, quick thinking, and a willingness to act when others hesitated. "We're not here to fight them head-on," Salonen said in a low, steady voice, his words cutting through the howling wind. "We're here to dismantle them piece by piece, hit their supply lines, disrupt their communications, strike hard and fast. Don't wait for the command to charge, just go." The plan was simple, but dangerous. No reinforcements, no heavy artillery, just a handful of men, equipped with explosives, rifles, and the sharpest minds in the Finnish military. They would hit the Soviet position hard, moving silently through the enemy's defenses, taking out key points in their command center and supply caches before they could retaliate. Salonen's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the Soviet base in the distance. There was no room for error. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Soviets would regroup and retaliate with force, and the position they had held so fiercely would be lost. But Salonen didn't allow himself to dwell on failure. There was no time for doubt. He took a final look at his men, each one focused, determined, ready to face what came next. They knew what was at stake. They had trained for this, lived for this. In the silence of the snow, they were ready. The signal was given, and as the first rays of moonlight pierced the clouds, the small unit began its descent toward the Soviet stronghold, moving like ghosts in the night, knowing that this would be their defining moment. The success of their mission would depend not on numbers, but on their ability to adapt, to move with the wind, and to strike before the enemy knew they were even there. The world around them was a sheet of white, a vast, endless expanse, where the landscape seemed to blur into the sky, both indistinguishable in the heavy darkness of the Finnish winter night. Captain Immo Salonen's ski troops moved through it like shadows, silent and swift. Their skis, crafted for precision, skimmed across the snow, leaving no trace of their passage. The stillness was broken only by the faint crunch of snow beneath their feet and the soft hiss of wind rushing through the trees. The world felt impossibly quiet, as though even the wind was holding its breath. Salonen's heart beat steadily, his focus absolute. They were close now, and the Soviet stronghold ahead was still unaware of their presence. It was a vast encampment, bristling with guards, equipment, and supplies, everything a conventional force would need to hold ground. But Salonen knew that they didn't have time for convention. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. The only advantage they had was speed, surprise, and the element of fearlessness that comes from being the underdog. They were moving faster now, their destination in sight. Salonen held up a hand, signaling his men to stop. His eyes scanned the area ahead, the Soviets' perimeter. Defenses were weak, scattered, and poorly manned at this time of night. His plan relied on this weakness. The element of surprise would carry them through the first wave of resistance. "On my mark," Salonen whispered into the night, his breath visible in the frozen air. "We move." The men nodded, their faces hidden behind hoods, their eyes fixed on Salonen. There was no need for words now. Every man understood the plan. The raid had begun. As they neared the Soviet perimeter, they split into smaller teams, using the snowdrifts for cover. One team took to the right, another to the left, each moving with precision, avoiding the few guards that still patrolled the area. They were ghosts in the snow, silent as shadows, unseen until it was too late. When the first explosion tore through the night, it was like a bolt of lightning splitting the silence, a deafening crack that sent a wave of chaos through the enemy camp. The Finnish troops didn't hesitate. They were already moving, their rifles up, their hearts racing. The blast had done its job. In the confusion, they struck quickly and with brutal efficiency, disabling supply trucks, blowing up ammunition caches, and taking out key Soviet officers. Salonen's men worked like a well-oiled machine, each soldier knowing his role, trusting his comrades without question. From the moment the first charge went off, there was no room for hesitation. The world seemed to collapse into a whirlwind of fire and noise, but the Finnish troops remained calm. They moved through the chaos like water through rock, cutting down their enemies one by one, planting explosives, sabotaging what they could, and vanishing before the Soviets even realized what had hit them. It was over in a matter of hours, but in that time, the Soviet camp had been gutted. Key supply lines were severed, equipment was destroyed, and Soviet soldiers lay sprawled across the snow. Salonen's men didn't celebrate. They didn't have time for that. They had done what was necessary. They had struck hard and fast, leaving behind a crippled enemy force that wouldn't know what hit them until it was too late. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the horizon, the men made their way back to the forest, their mission complete. They had come like ghosts, and now, like ghosts, they were gone, disappearing into the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their success and the shattered remnants of the Soviet position. Salonen took one last look at the smoke rising from the Soviet encampment, his eyes cold and calculating. The raid had worked. They had done the impossible, and for a moment, it felt as though the war had shifted just slightly in their favor. But Salonen knew better than to get too comfortable. This was just one battle. There would be more, but for now, they had won, and that would have to be enough. As the first blasts rang out across the Soviet encampment, the night was lit by the fiery flashes of explosions, followed by the deafening roar of chaos. The surprise was complete. The Soviet soldiers, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the attack, scrambled to respond. But it was too late. The Finnish ski troops had already done their work, swift, efficient, and unrelenting. Captain Immo Salonen stood a few hundred yards away, watching the destruction unfold with a cold, steady gaze. The enemy was floundering, their command structure unraveling as they tried to regroup. But Salonen knew that the success of the raid depended not just on striking hard, but on disappearing just as quickly. His men were already pulling back, vanishing into the snowy wilderness like shadows. From the moment the first charge had detonated, the raid had been a blur of movement. Explosives had been placed at key points, supply lines, ammunition depots, communication hubs, taking out everything the Soviet forces needed to stay organized. Soviet trucks, once filled with supplies, now lay in ruins, burning brightly in the night. Weapons, caches that had once been used to push against Finland's defenses, were now useless, their contents either destroyed or scattered across the snow. Salonen felt a grim satisfaction as the firelight reflected off the snow, casting long shadows over the battlefield. He knew this raid would change everything, not just for the Soviet forces, but for the Finnish men who had fought and bled for this moment. They had struck at the heart of the Soviet machine, crippled their ability to launch an effective counteroffensive, and left them scrambling to rebuild. But Salonen's mind didn't linger on victory. He knew better than to celebrate too early. They had done what was needed, but there was still work to be done. The Soviets would not take this blow lightly. Salonen was certain that they would send reinforcements, regroup, and retaliate. But for now, they had won a crucial battle, and that, at least, would give them a chance to breathe. The mission had been executed with precision, but the true impact would be felt in the coming days. The Soviets would be disoriented, their morale shattered by a raid they could never have anticipated. The loss of key supplies and the destruction of their infrastructure would set them back, perhaps more than they knew. For the first time in months, the balance of power on the northern front had shifted, if only slightly. As Salonen led his men back into the depths of the forest, the sound of the retreating trucks echoing behind him, He couldn't help but feel that they had done something monumental. The raid had been reckless, crazy even, but it had worked. It had worked because they had done what no one thought possible. They had taken the fight to the Soviets on their own terms, and in doing so, they had left a mark that would not be easily erased. The raid's impact would ripple through the Soviet lines, not just in military terms, but in the hearts and minds of both sides. To the men in Salonen's unit, it was a victory earned not with overwhelming force, but with cunning, speed, and an unshakable will to survive. As dawn began to break, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, the men felt the weight of what they had accomplished. They had changed the course of the war, even if only for a moment, and for that, they would be remembered. Back at the Finnish camp, the men were quiet. The raid, a brutal and swift success, had taken its toll. The fires from the Soviet encampment still flickered on the horizon, casting an eerie glow across the snow. The night's triumph was now behind them, but the weight of the cost lingered in the frozen air. The men were exhausted, their faces smeared with soot, their bodies aching from the brutal cold. Some wore their fatigue like a cloak, hunched and silent as they huddled around small fires, while others stared off into the distance, their eyes hollow from the night's violence. Captain Immo Salonen stood apart from the group, his posture rigid despite the exhaustion gnawing at him. The cold wind sliced through the night, but it wasn't the temperature that chilled him. It was the loss of a man, one of his own, left behind in the chaos of the raid. His name was Simo, a young soldier with a quick wit and a steady hand, who had been one of the first to fall when the Soviets began to return fire. Salonen had seen it all before: the broken bodies, the shattered lives, but it never got easier. War had a way of claiming people before their time, and no one was ever ready for it. Salonen's thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of boots in the snow. Sergeant Jukka Dent, his reliable second in command, approached, his face grim and tired. Salonen didn't need to ask. He knew what Dent was going to say. The men had taken the hill, but it had cost them. "He's gone, isn't he?" Salonen asked, his voice low. Dent nodded, his eyes cast down toward the ground. "We couldn't do anything for him. The Soviets hit hard. We barely made it out." Salonen didn't respond immediately. He turned away from Dent, his eyes scanning the camp, where the men were cleaning their weapons and patching up their gear. Some were resting, others cleaning wounds, all of them trying to forget the chaos of the night, if only for a few hours. But Salonen knew better. This wasn't something that could be forgotten. Not by the men who fought here. The cost of the raid would stay with them, with him, for as long as they lived. He wiped his brow, feeling the cold sweat beneath his helmet. His mind flickered back to the moments of the raid, the explosions, the flashes of fire, the screams in the distance. They had won, yes. They had crippled the Soviets' position and bought some time for their comrades on the front lines. But at what cost? 1 man down, a dozen wounded, and the weight of survival pressing down on every soldier. No victory in war was without sacrifice. "We can't dwell on this," Salonen said after a long pause. "We mourn later. For now, we keep moving. The war isn't over." Dent's eyes flickered with hesitation, but he nodded. The men had always followed Salonen without question. His resolve had gotten them through the worst, and it would get them through this too. The night continued to drag on, the air growing colder still as the men began to settle down, preparing for the next stage of their journey. There was no time to rest on their laurels. They were deep behind enemy lines, and though the raid had been a success, the war was far from won. The Soviets would regroup, and they would come back with vengeance. The cost of war was something Salonen had always understood. It was a price he had paid for every mission, for every success, for every battle. The cost was life. And if the men of the Finnish ski troops were to survive, they would have to pay it again and again. As Salonen looked out at the men in the camp, each one carrying the weight of the night's work, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. They had struck a blow against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But that pride was tempered by the stark reality that the next battle was already waiting for them just beyond the horizon. And so, they waited in the snow, the cost of victory already etched into their hearts, ready for whatever came next. The days following the raid were filled with a quiet tension, the kind that settles in the aftermath of a battle. While the snow-covered forest remained eerily still, the reverberations of the night's actions rippled far beyond the Finnish Ski Troops' small camp. The raid had been a strike of lightning in the dark, and its impact would soon be felt across the northern front. The Soviets, reeling from the surprise attack, were left scrambling to regain control. Salonen's men had taken out their supplies, disrupted their communications, and left a gaping hole in their northern defenses. It was a blow the enemy hadn't anticipated, and it rattled them. The Soviets, known for their vast numbers and heavily fortified positions, had been forced to confront the unthinkable, that a small, mobile unit of Finnish soldiers, armed only with basic gear and audacity, could cripple their operations. On the other side of the front, news of the raid spread quickly. For the Finns, it was a moment of rare victory, and the morale boost was palpable. For days, soldiers whispered about the bravery and precision of the ski troops, who had defied the odds and struck deep into enemy territory. To the Finnish men still holding their positions on the front lines, the raid was more than just a military success. It was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that they could still fight back, even when everything seemed stacked against them. The Finns had long been underdogs in the war, fighting against a much larger enemy. But the raid proved that they could hit where it hurt. It wasn't just about the supplies destroyed or the damage inflicted on the Soviet forces. It was about sending a message to their own people, to the Soviets, and even to the world watching from the outside. The Finnish ski troops had shown that even the smallest of forces could bring a giant to its knees. But as Salonen walked through his camp that morning, he could already sense the shift. The Soviets would retaliate. They wouldn't simply accept the blow without striking back. Their humiliation would be felt on the battlefield, and the response would be swift. Salonen knew better than to let his men get complacent. One success didn't mean the war was over. They had struck a blow, but the enemy was far from defeated. Salonen gathered his men around the campfire, his face drawn and weary from the previous night's work. The men sat in silence, the weight of their mission and the aftermath pressing down on their shoulders. They had won, but Salonen knew they had to stay sharp. The Soviets would recover, and soon enough, they would strike back harder than ever. The question wasn't whether the raid had changed the course of the war it had. The real question was whether the Finns could capitalize on that momentum before the enemy regrouped and turned the tide once more. Days later, word came from higher command. The Soviets were indeed in disarray. Their lines had been stretched thin by the raid, and their progress had been halted at least for a time. The impact had been felt far beyond the immediate area. It wasn't a turning point in the war, but it was a critical delay that had bought the Allies more time. Salonen's men had given the Finnish forces the breathing room they desperately needed. And now, every commander on the northern front knew they had a chance to push back. But Salonen wasn't one to rest on his laurels. While the victory was celebrated, he reminded his men that it wasn't over. The raid had shaken the Soviets, but the war was still far from won. They had proven they could win against the odds, but Salonen knew the next battle would be just as unforgiving. For now, the Finns had their victory, and it was a victory they would remember. But the war, as it always had, would continue to demand more. The night after the raid, as the last of the explosions faded into the distance and the night air grew colder, Captain Immo Salonen stood at the edge of their camp, looking out over the snow-covered expanse. The forest stretched out before him, silent and eternal, as if nothing had happened at all. It was a stillness that felt unnatural after the chaos they had just unleashed, the fire, the shouting, the rush of destruction. And yet, as Salonen stood there, he knew that the battle was far from over. The raid had only bought them time, but time was a precious commodity in this war, and every second they gained mattered. As he stared into the vast wilderness, Salonen couldn't help but reflect on what they had just accomplished. They had struck hard at the heart of the Soviet forces, using nothing but their wits, their skis, and their sheer determination. But now, as the night crept on and the fires from the destroyed Soviet encampment burned low in the distance, Salonen knew the true cost of their success. This wasn't a fairy tale victory. It was a temporary reprieve, one that had come with its own sacrifices, lives lost, wounds sustained, and most painfully, the toll it had taken on the men who had executed the raid. The Finnish soldiers who had participated in the raid were still recovering. Some were already nursing wounds, their faces drawn with exhaustion and pain. Others sat around the fire, their eyes blank, as if still trapped in the chaos of the attack. These were men who had seen death and destruction firsthand, who had come to understand the weight of war in ways no one should ever have to. They were heroes, yes, but they were also just men. Men who had been pushed to their limits, tested in ways that would forever change them. Salonen walked through the camp, pausing by the soldiers as they huddled close to the fires for warmth. Some were repairing their gear, others were sharpening their weapons, and a few were just sitting, staring into the flames. They had done something incredible. They had defied the odds and struck at an enemy that seemed insurmountable. But in the silence of the night, there was no celebration. There were no cheers or loud declarations. They had survived, and that in itself was victory enough. Salonen stopped by one of his men, a young soldier named Mikko, who had fought fiercely during the raid. Mikko's face was smeared with dirt and blood, and his hands trembled as he worked to clean his rifle. Salonen had seen many men like Mikko, soldiers who had faced unimaginable hardships but still pressed on, driven by something deeper than just survival. It was a kind of determination that couldn't be taught, only forged in the crucible of war. "We've done it," Mikko said quietly, almost to himself. "We've changed things, haven't we?" Salonen nodded, his voice soft but firm. "We've done something they'll remember, but it's not over yet, not by a long shot." The reality of the war hung heavy in the air. The raid had crippled the Soviets, but they would regroup, rearm, and return with vengeance. Salonen knew this victory was fleeting, a single moment in a much larger battle, but it was a moment that would define them. He walked to the edge of the camp, where the darkness met the horizon. The snow stretched out endlessly before him, the frozen expanse reflecting the dim light of the moon. For a brief moment, he felt a strange peace, a quiet pride. His men had done something extraordinary, something no one had expected. They had turned the tide, even if only for a moment. They had shown the world and themselves that the impossible was possible, and that, in itself, was enough to make this night unforgettable. The raid had not just changed the course of the war, it had changed them. And for Salonen, that was a victory no enemy could ever take away. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Salonen gathered his men. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just the quiet, determined resolve of soldiers who knew the next fight would be waiting for them, and that they would face it as they had always faced war together. This night had defined them, and it would stay with them for as long as they fought.